We got to talk about this. It's been a couple of days, and the CDC made a clarification statement about just kind of some of the data that we've gotten from COVID-19 mortality, and just showing that the majority of people who have died from COVID-19 did have coexisting other medical conditions, other comorbidities, and specifically on their death certificate, there were other issues that came up, and somehow that got interpreted intentionally or unintentionally in a most moronic way you could possibly imagine. There's no way that any competent physician would interpret any of the data on there the way it was kind of put out on social media. So essentially what came out of that was some people thought that, well, the majority of these people didn't die from COVID. Oh, I mean, that's just completely wrong. Essentially what they were saying when they said they didn't die from COVID would be the equivalent of like a school shooter coming into a school, shooting a bunch of kids, and then you saying, oh, they didn't die from the school shooting. They died from the bleeding. I mean, they had things like the comorbidities that were listed on here were things like ARDS, pneumonia, sepsis, respiratory failure. These are exactly the things that COVID causes that leads you to die from COVID. That's not a comorbidity. That is a result of the virus. The virus itself can't just jump into someone's body and then boom, they just drop dead. And it's like, oh, they didn't have anything wrong with them. They just had a virus. It has to cause some sort of organ damage, thereby a comorbidity in this sense, even though that's not really a comorbidity. It's really a result of the disease process. Just as bleeding is a result of someone stabbing someone or shooting someone. So just look at a few videos. One of my favorites, ZDoggMD, he breaks it down one of the best ways possible. He's just beside himself, as any competent physician would be. And let's just take a look.
Since the start of the pandemic, doctors have said that most coronavirus deaths have been due to complications from the virus. That hasn't changed.
We're sad to report that we had an additional death due to COVID complications.
CDC data shows that. It says 6% of deaths are from coronavirus alone. The vast majority, 94%, are from the virus and other contributing factors. Those include issues caused by the virus, like pneumonia, and others like chronic respiratory problems, high blood pressure, and diabetes.
Okay, again, how are you supposed to die from coronavirus if you don't have a complication from it? I mean, if it doesn't cause any problems for you, then by definition, you're an asymptomatic carrier. If you're symptomatic, it means you have inflammation in the lungs, otherwise known as pneumonitis, or you actually have pneumonia, or you get systemic inflammatory response syndrome leading to renal failure, leading to cardiovascular collapse. Otherwise, there's no way to die from COVID. Jesus.
We know people who have those issues and others are at higher risk of trouble from coronavirus. But this data took on another meaning when East Tennessee politicians began referencing it. There was no shock and nothing done quietly. The CDC posted this information to its website. The claim the coronavirus only killed 9,000 Americans is false. The difference comes down to one simple statement. Most of our 183,000 coronavirus deaths had causes in addition to COVID-19, not instead of it.
Well, I mean, yeah. Well, I mean, I'm just going to have to piggyback off of ZDoggMD here. I mean, because he just puts it no better than I can. I mean, this is just a great talk and explanation. And I'm just going to cut this up and let's just roll the clips.
All right, here's the deal. What happened was CDC released death certificate data for about 160,000 deaths that included COVID-19 on their death certificates. Now, any medical professional who fills out death certificates understands kind of how it's done.
Oh, okay. Let's stop right there for a second. Doctors do not care about what the final diagnosis is when someone dies. Okay? They don't care. And I say that just because I remember there was something going around, some rumor, some crazy thing going around about doctors that were putting COVID down as the diagnosis on these people when they did not have a COVID for some reason. That doesn't happen.
You list the main cause of death and then anything that contributes. And so the certificate can have multiple things on it. You can have things that were pre-existing like diabetes, high blood pressure, obesity, and then you can have the main disease, like say it's COVID-19, and then you can have things that the COVID-19 might have led to in the visit, like respiratory failure, respiratory arrest, cardiac arrest, heart failure, adult respiratory distress syndrome, and you list all those things on the document. Now, here's what happened. What CDC did was they put all this out and they said, listen, 6% of all the fatalities that listed COVID-19 somewhere had only COVID-19.
Okay. Let's stop right there. If someone only put COVID-19 as a diagnosis on a death certificate, it's because they were hungry, they were ready to go to lunch, they were at the end of their shift, they were tired, and they just needed to get that death certificate just filled out. That is not how death certificates are filled out. It's just exhausting. Okay, if somebody comes in, let me give you an example. Somebody comes in with a gunshot wound. Typically, the death certificate won't just say gunshot wound. Of course, that's exactly why they died if they got shot and they bled out to death. But you're going to have things like cardiac arrest, hemorrhagic shock, gunshot wound, penetrating injury, or something of that nature. Those are going to be the diagnoses. Would anyone in their right mind say that the hemorrhagic shock or the cardiac arrest was a comorbidity? No. Nobody in their right mind would say that. But that's what the death certificate would say. If you look back at the majority of death certificates for people who got shot and killed. I'm just saying.
On the death certificate, meaning they didn't list anything else. Okay? And the way that was interpreted by people online who have a particular agenda, they don't agree with the way this is being handled. They think that the lockdowns are too severe. They think this thing is a hoax, whatever it is. The way it was interpreted is they said, well, this is crazy. It means that people have all these other medical problems that are listed on the death certificate. They're dying of those, and it just so happens they also have COVID. So they're dying with COVID instead of COVID, and that 6% is the true death rate. It's 6% of 160,000 or whatever that is. So it's vastly smaller, much less serious. Why are we doing all this? It's a hoax, and the CDC admits it in their data. Just stop for a second. I don't care what your politics are. I don't think if you disagree with what's happening and lockdowns are bad and masks are dumb and all that, look, I actually am sympathetic to you. But what I'm not sympathetic to is misunderstanding the science in the simplest form. Anybody who put that information out there saying, look, needs to be understood as a completely uncredible source of anything having to do with medicine ever.
Yeah. Okay, let's just wrap this up by going to our American expert, Dr. Fauci. Let him wrap it up with some sensibility, please.
Well, the CDC came out with a statement which really did reflect the reality that, in fact, if you look at the people who died of COVID disease, the point that the CDC was trying to make was that a certain percentage of them had nothing else but just COVID. That does not mean that someone who has hypertension or diabetes who dies of COVID didn't die of COVID-19. They did. So the numbers that you've been hearing, the 180,000 plus deaths, are real deaths from COVID-19.
Don't forget to subscribe to be notified when we drop new Dr. Keith episodes. And please post any questions you have about this episode or any other medical questions in the comments.